Okay, looks like we are live here on the interwebs, as Michael Scott calls it, I think. I'm Eric Hörst. Welcome to the Training Café. We're open for business, and I hope you have a cup of coffee to sip with me here at the cafe. This is our once or twice monthly meeting where I share my hopeful wisdom from all these years as a climber, as a coach, and answer some of your training questions, and also often talk about a topic of the day. Today's topic of discussion will be training around, not through, injuries, which unfortunately is a predicament that many climbers are in. I think if you climb long enough or hard enough, you will be in this predicament, perhaps more often than you'd like to be. Because let's face it, climbing is a sport that is hard on the body. Not those beginner level climbs where you're standing on your feet, but as you boulder and lead, climb harder, steeper, longer routes, as you train harder, our fingers grabbing onto those little holds, carrying a high percentage of our body weight is hard on the connective tissues. And same thing with the elbows and shoulders. Years of climbing accumulates chronic, issues, and there can be an acute issue. You get into a weird position, dislocate a shoulder, tear your labrum. You can have acute injuries, and of course the injuries that come about as a result of a fall, falling off a boulder problem, twisting your ankle, or in a worst case, maybe blowing out a tendon or ligament or breaking a bone. These are all things that are actually not all that uncommon if you hang around enough climbers. And unfortunately, that means that either you have to stop training for a period of time, or you find ways to train around your injury so that you're not kind of backtracking on your conditioning. Because, if you want to try to improve season over season, year over year, especially your first 10 or 20 years in the sport, you should be building on that foundation, that physical foundation, your strength, your power, your endurance, your connective tissue strength, your tendons and ligaments hypertrophy on a very kind of almost, on a microscopic scale, but it becomes meaningful year over year over year. If you can strengthen your tendons and ligaments, they'll be able to endure higher stress loads, grabbing smaller holds, climbing more often. And, that, of course, is the goal. Every time you get injured and have to stop training, or if you stop training, then you detrain, you lose conditioning. And obviously, many climbers, when they get injured, just keep training and climbing as if they're not injured, and that act of trying to climb through the injury, while in a very minor tweak or, insignificant injury, then maybe that's possible. But it's a very fine line, and very often if you try to climb through an injury, it will get worse and worse and worse, or just never heal. And so in the case of the classic finger tendon pulley strain, where there's perhaps a partial tear, you need to dial things back significantly initially after the injury. You want to not stop all loading, but do appropriate loading in terms of rehab at just a fraction of body weight. And I'm not going to get into the rehab protocols and techniques, but to have a tweaked tendon and be doing minimum edge or weighted edge fingerboard hangs would be totally inappropriate. But if you are doing training at 20% of body weight, or standing and lifting light weights with different grip positions, avoiding the crimp grip, of course, you can actually speed up healing by exposing the injured tissues to mild but daily loading. And again, I don't want to say much more on that specific injury, but the idea is you don't stop training altogether, and oftentimes redirect your training is the best way to go. And so in the case of having that common finger pulley injury, you might have to stop your intensive training, your campus training, your limit bouldering, your system walling, grabbing of any small crimps. That has to cease for a period of time, a few weeks, perhaps as much as a couple of months if it's a more significant tendon pulley strain. But all the while, you can still be doing your pulling training where you're grabbing onto a pull-up bar, let's say, or some rings to do ring-type training exercises. You tape up the finger and you go about doing training that doesn't stress the injured finger. Obviously, things like core training you can do regardless of having a finger or arm injury. You can do a lot of your core exercises. Maybe if you have an injured shoulder, you can't do front levers as part of your core training, but you can certainly do a lot of exercises on the ground, like crunches and things like that. And generalized conditioning, that's what I'm a big fan of, having injured climbers redirect into doing an increase in some generalized training. It could be running, biking, hiking, swimming, those types of activities that aren't climbing specific. They're not going to affect the injured finger, elbow, or shoulder, but you can get out and get some valuable cardiovascular training. I think having a stronger heart is a good thing for climbers. It helps pump more blood through all of your body, including your arms. When you're doing hard climbing, you can recover faster if you have a higher stroke volume. And running has been shown in studies to be valuable for climbers in terms of helping accelerate recovery and helping them make the most of their aerobic energy system. So I'm a fan of doing at least a bit of generalized aerobic training pretty much year-round. Go for a run 2 or 3 days a week. But maybe if you're climbing less because of an injury, maybe you can ramp it up to doing 4 or 5 days a week of some aerobic training. And that will not only feed back and become valuable systemically in terms of your conditioning, but also perhaps help your body composition a little bit. Climbing is a strength to weight ratio sport, and when people get injured and cut back on training or stop training, they often put on body weight. And so they come back from the injury not only weaker, but heavier. And so if you are taking some time off from hard climbing, hard training, and just doing some rehab of an upper body injury, why not ramp up the cardiovascular training and do some of that generalized training and double up on the core training that you can do, and therefore come back from your injury really fit in terms of your conditioning, your core training, and know that if you took a month or 2 off from your intensive fingerboard training or intensive system wall or campus board training, if you took a month or 2 off of that due to one of those somewhat debilitating injuries, fingers, elbows, shoulders, can really shut you down as a climber in terms of doing hard things. And so you take a month or 2 off, you will detrain somewhat. But if you are a well-conditioned climber before the injury, it will come back really fast. Oftentimes, it'll come back in half of the time that you had kind of the detraining. So let's say you have a finger injury and you have to stop serious finger training, hangboarding, for 2 months. Well, once it heals up, you will regain and get back to pretty much close to where you were in only maybe 1 month of dedicated training. Again, the key is just not to rush back into it too soon and tweak the injury worse. And so I guess one thing I'll share with you is I'm kind of in that situation. It's what gave me the idea for today's topic is I have this middle finger that's been bothering me. It actually goes back to the end of last climbing season in November when I was on a climbing trip and climbing 4 days a week. And as an older climber, it's kind of what is referred to as a capsulitis. It's perhaps arthritis type inflammation and the joint capsule becoming tender and painful when I crimp hard. And so, I'm in my winter training mode right now, hoping to be fit and 100% healthy for spring season. So as much as I want to be training hard right now, I've actually, the last few weeks, removed all intensive training, and I've done just what I explained. I've increased my running by a couple of days a week. I've increased my core conditioning. I'm doing a little more weight training with dumbbells for my rotator cuff and shoulder muscles, and pushing the antagonist muscle training. I'm investing 2 or 3 sessions a week into that, whereas normally I would only do it maybe once a week, just kind of maintenance training. And I'm still doing some hangs. I'm still doing some loading. I'm still climbing on the treadwall on big holds, but I'm not doing anything too crimpy. Now, it's not a pulley strain, so that's good news. The bad news is, as an older climber, these kind of knuckle, capsulitis type situations are hard to predict how they're just going to play out. You just kind of have to wait them out and try not to aggravate them for a while. And and so I think a couple of weeks where I am not doing anything too crimpy, too stressful. I'm still loading, but loading open-handed. You can see I have tape on it. I'm kind of just stabilizing the joint capsule with an X tape, for all of my workouts. And I'm still kind of going about my normal training schedule, but doing a little more of some other things, and really doing less, not really any, hangboard training or real crimpy climbing right now. So that's kind of my way to work around this, and hopefully in a couple of more weeks I can return to my regular training schedule, get back on track for spring climbing season, March, April, May here in the East. I think the toughest situation for climbers is shoulder injuries, and there's so many different things that can happen in your shoulder that it's hard for me to speak to rehab exercises or even what training you can do. Some shoulder injuries, you could do some isometric, lock-off training, and maintain some of that pulling strength and power and conditioning. But other shoulder injuries, rotator cuff tendon partial tear, let's say, a labrum tear, those are painful injuries, and it's tough to do much with the injured shoulder. Oftentimes you have one injured shoulder and one good shoulder. Well, you can still do some training with the good shoulder, but the injured shoulder, you're doing rehab, but very little regular training. And, with regard to the shoulder injuries, because there are a number of different things that happen to climbers' shoulders, it's hard without the evaluation of a physician, and even sometimes getting an MRI, it's hard to know exactly what is the cause of your shoulder pain. And I'm an advocate of, going to the doctor sooner than later. Instead of waiting a year or two and the shoulder gets worse and worse and worse and you really don't know what's going on, when it starts to affect your training and climbing, go to a doctor right away and try to get to the bottom of it. And oftentimes, you can kind of nip it in the bud and get a, physical therapy program, kind of some rehab exercise protocol to do diligently 3, 4, 5 days a week that can help correct the problem and prevent it from progressing to something worse. Now, certain injuries, if you fall off a boulder and land on an outstretched arm and tear your labrum, or you're in a gastone move and your shoulder subluxes and you tear the labrum, that is an injury that really doesn't heal itself. You can strengthen the joint and stabilize the joint, and return some stability after the labrum has been torn, but with the tear there's going to be lifelong issues as a climber trying to push hard. And so a surgical intervention is often needed to completely, not correct, but, as best as possible, get you back to climbing hard. It often does take a surgical intervention. So pay attention to your shoulders, that is for sure, and seek medical advice sooner rather than later. But kind of the bottom line for me is stay active. I think the worst thing an injured athlete can do is just stop all activity, because you need loading to help spur on the healing process, to give the signal for collagen alignment to be proper in the injured body part. And you need to stay active to maintain your body composition. You need to stay active to kind of keep your head in the game and stay optimistic. And there's kind of an inertia to when you stop all exercise and just live in front of your computer or the TV. There's kind of an inertia to that it's tough to break free then after a period of time. So I think whenever possible, stay active as long as you can. Okay, so I've droned on here for about 15 minutes on that topic. Let's move on to some of the questions that have been typed in. And I just realized we did not sip coffee together as we always do at the Training Cafe, because we know that climbers tend to enjoy their coffee almost as much as they enjoy climbing. And so if you have your cup of coffee, or if you have your other beverage, this is my Endurex that I'm drinking as I'm in the middle of a workout right now. But I took a break to talk to you all. And so let's raise our cups of coffee and sip together. Climbers around the world, unite. Okay, so coffee, and then some of my Endurex mixed with collagen, which is my drink of choice as I'm training. So, okay, let's get to some questions here that have been typed in, quite a few. So we're going to try to blow through these, and I would like to get back to my workout in hopefully 15 or 20 minutes here. I know the sound on the right speaker of the video isn't working. Interesting. Okay, well, thank you, Fred. I hope it seems, since we have people watching, that you can hear me somewhat, but it sounds like we only have sound to one side of the computer, so I hope that works out. Next question up here. Okay, so Armstrong, if you're able, if I read that right. Add sports injury and a few viruses a year, only a few months remain for me to train at peak form. What do you think of improving work capacity? How it help limit injuries? Yeah, I mean, there's really two parts to work capacity. And one part is, kind of that muscular conditioning, the cardiovascular conditioning, which over seasons and years, the capacity to exercise goes up. And the other side of the coin is the loading capacity of your connective tissues. Someone new to climbing who's never loaded their fingers before, they get into climbing and climb 3 days a week, and they often develop achy tendons in their fingers because, prior to becoming a climber, their fingers never got a workout like that. Those tendon pulleys and flexor tendons were never worked so rigorously in that person's life before until they became a climber. And as I mentioned a little while ago, the connective tissues adapt to loading. There is very, very slow hypertrophy, thickening. There's new collagen material laid down and aligned that increases the strength, the modulus of the connective tissues, but it takes years to significantly increase that. So the elite climbers, you think about the pros who do high amounts of training, high amounts of hard climbing, 3 or 4, sometimes 5 days a week, that would break a normal climber. They have over many years been able to take their capacity to the next level. And in doing so, there's kind of this intuiting of where that fine line is between how much they can do and adapt without getting injured. And if they cross that line, they end up getting injured. And, because if you're a pro or a recreational climber, but definitely if you're a pro, an injury can end your season. And so you can be on your way to the next 5:15 ascent or the next World Cup win. And if you cross that line and get injured, that season can be done. And it can be a really big setback heading into the next season because you lose that high level of training. And so the goal, I think, for all climbers should be, if you're really into this sport over the course of many years, you can't be doing the same training, obviously, as you did 5 years ago, nor should you be doing, the same amount. You should be doing more. There should be a gradual increase, but, it has to go up gradually, often in a discontinuous fashion. You have training blocks where you increase loading, and then you have a deload period, then maybe you have a performance period, and then you rebuild into the next block. And then, month to month, there may not be a big increase in the capacity. There's probably not. But when you aggregate a year together and compare it to last year, if you track these things, would hopefully see that there's an increase in the volume. Now, there's other factors to take into account, like how high intensity the training is. Then, at least during that phase, the volume by necessity has to be less. And whereas if you're doing more submaximal climbing, route training, kind of aerobic base conditioning to build capacity, you can really build the volumes up week over week over week for a few months before you kind of reset things or readjust things. So it's a question that really needs to be answered in a more personalized way. In your case, you mentioned having, the virus, being sick and having some injuries, and, all of those things, you have to kind of work around and try to maintain as much conditioning as you can, as you're dealing with those obstacles. But it might be, the next season or the next year until you get past all that and can actually start to build to a higher level of capacity. So I'm not sure if I really hit the target there to answer your question. Again, it really does need to be quite personalized. Okay, next up, greetings from Toronto. Do you want to recommend in regards to having a cold while training 3 or 4 times a week? Is it okay to max hangboard at home, do core, etc., or just completely stop and rest? That's a great question, because sometimes you're sick, but you're not really that sick. So again, it's kind of tough to give a very specific answer here, but in my case, like when I feel ill, I will still try to be active and at least do a partial workout. But if I have a fever, then I do no training, because that shows that there's, something significant that your body's fighting. So a fever should be a no-go in terms of training. You want to let your body, focus 100% on getting well. If you have a flu-type bug, you may not have a fever, but you could be dehydrated. If you're, have diarrhea, if you threw up. So again, exercising, doing intensive training in a dehydrated state, not a good idea. You could certainly do some flexibility training, maybe a little bit of core training, some very light rehab exercises. But in the case of having a fever or being dehydrated, a pretty significant case of the flu, I would just take a few days off or even as much as a week off and just let your body heal up. Now, in terms of having the sniffles, having a cold, which I seem to once a year, often it starts off as allergies and turns into something a little more like a head cold, but it's not usually accompanied by a fever. And in those situations, I do try to pretty much train through it as if I'm not sick. I will go about, especially strength exercises, I think are the ones that, again, if you have a mild cold, you can do a strength workout, maybe not the full shooting match, but a stripped down version of it, and kind of, if nothing else, maintain that kind of finger force and pulling strength. I wouldn't be doing long days at the crag or going out for long runs, things that really are more systemically stressful on the body, because again, you won't allow your body to have energy to heal itself. But doing a stripped down version of your normal workout program in the case of a head cold and a less, let's say a mild illness, I think that would be in many cases just fine. Okay. This is, I guess, a follow-up on my question about the knuckle condition. He says, barbell finger rolling help to flush it out, 2 or 3 days a week. Yeah, I do that type of thing. I do, as part of my warm-up exercises, I roll dumbbells in my hands. And that's something you actually don't want to do if you have a pulley tweak, because then there's almost kind of the flexor tendon sawing as you roll your fingers up and down. You want to do more isometric loading that's very low intensity in the case of a pulley injury. But with these types of capsulitis and joint injuries, you do need some loading, you do need some movement of fluid. I do a lot of stretching and those types of things. Sometimes just doing this seems to help out a little bit. So yeah, I appreciate what you're saying. And again, I think for older athletes especially, you want to be moving every day. That's my goal as an older athlete. At the very least, I go out for a walk for a half an hour every day, and do some stretching every day and some foam rolling every day. Those are like just mandatory. And then on top of that, then I have the different types of workouts that I do that are more focused and stressful. Okay, next question here. Philip, how would you adjust your macro plan when a tweak or injury has happened? If it's structured after a strength to power to peak period, would you adjust that? Yeah, that's a good question. Like if you're in the middle of a block, strength to power endurance, and then perhaps deload and then perform, part of you wants to kind of stay with the program and see it through. And if it's a very minor injury, maybe it's just a few days that you have to dial things back and kind of train around the injury. And then, a week later, there's enough healing to continue on with the program. What I'm describing there is a very, very, the slightest tweak of a finger. More commonly when climbers get a tweak of a pulley that elicits pain when they're crimping and pulling, then there's enough of a tear there that it's not going to mend itself in a few days or a single week. And so in that scenario, it's probably a 2 to 4 week time frame to do some rehab loading, but you have to remove the real stressful training on that injured finger. You can buy one of these pulley splints, which is a step above taping tightly. The pulley splints have been shown to be quite effective if placed and tightened properly. They're used more extensively in Europe than they are here in the United States, but my physician friends in Europe tell me that they have good success and can help climbers get back to climbing sooner if they put on a pulley splint literally the day they injure that finger. And for the first week, maybe wear the pulley splint, during all their waking hours when they're grabbing anything, and then for the next couple of weeks, just wear it for when you're doing climbing, loading, and even return to high-end climbing. But every finger tweak is different, and if you climb decades as I have, I can't tell you how many finger tweaks I've had. I've been climbing 46 years, so I've had probably 10 or 12 episodes of that little A2 pulley tweak. The most frequently tweaked for me has been this non-dominant ring finger, which is most common. That one itself is probably over 46 years tweaked and caused me issues half a dozen times. But I've also had them in the middle fingers, never in the pinky, though that has happened. Alex Megos tore a pinky pulley several years ago, so it can happen. So most climbers are going to experience these, and you, after enough experience, kind of know how they play out, and you can kind of intuit when it happens. This just happened. It's very minor, so I'm going to be more, proactive in rehabbing it, and not try to push through. Whereas the first couple times a younger or newer climber has a pulley tweak, well, it's something they haven't experienced before. And so, of course, they're younger and more passionate and often try to climb through it. And then they learn the hard way that turns what could have been just a few week injury into several months or maybe a season that it bothers them. And so eventually you learn the prudence of dialing things back immediately when you experience the tweak, and then doing things like rehab protocols, consuming collagen before you climb, before you do your rehab, to things that have been shown to accelerate healing. Wearing a pulley splint has been shown to accelerate healing in the case of a pulley tweak or tear. Okay, Philip, again, I guess a follow-up, trading block, pause it completely, pick it up. Yeah, so I kind of answered that about, if it's very, very slight, then maybe you just pause it for a week and hope that it corrects. But if it's more significant, then I think you have to kind of break the training cycle, go about the rehab, get healed up, and then either start a new cycle or see what your season's looking like and decide, how you want to go about things going forward. Okay, so another comment about the mic. I am so sorry. I have this little lavalier mic on, and I'm not sure why it is causing us trouble today. I apologize for that. Yes. Volume low here too. Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Okay, well, next time I'll try to get my audio situation figured out a little better. I did test it before I started it, and I thought I had pretty good signal, but I guess something is run amok here. Okay, looks like we have one more question here from Jonathan Morgan. Do you believe that shoulder injuries can lead to making compensations in movement that lead to lateral upper condylitis? Yeah, I think that happens. There's evidence that type of thing happens with athletes in a variety of sports. You change your technique, perhaps in a throwing sport or in any type of overhead movement sport. You change your technique, because your shoulder's injured, and then you can bring about an injury somewhere else. And so, yes, I think that can be the case. Again, shoulders, are, I think, for over the long term, the bigger problem for climbers. The finger pulley injuries come and go, and most people will experience them. Some genetically blessed people have few connective tissue injuries. Some genetically cursed. There are 3 or 4 gene variants that are associated with higher frequency of connective tissue injuries. So if you have those, whether you're a soccer player, you're going to have more ankle and knee injuries, or if you're a climber, you're going to have more shoulder, elbow, finger injuries. That's a very interesting study. And actually, I'm in the process of recording a podcast right now on the role of genetics in climbing performance. I hopefully will have the podcast finished up and posted maybe tomorrow, so keep your eyes out for that. It's an interesting topic. But everybody's different, of course, when it comes to this. I talk to climbers of decades, and they all have kind of achy shoulders, and many of them have had shoulder surgeries. I had one of my shoulders cleaned up a few years ago, and bone spurs develop. I mean, there's a variety of things. The tendons fray. The labrums are often torn. Even if you don't know it, a lot of climbers are walking around with torn labrums, and you don't know it until you get an MRI. And so the shoulders over years and decades take a beating. The fingers come and go. Those injuries often are mild if you are self-aware and disciplined. You can get through them quickly. And the elbows are pesky. The elbow injuries, the medial epicondylitis and lateral epicondylitis. I have, in my climbing career, often had twinges of pain that would develop for a few sessions or a week, and I would be very proactive in beginning some rehab, removing the exercises or route or boulder that is provoking it. Just stop it. The thing that's provoking it should be stopped and replaced with some rehab injuries. Make sure you're getting enough protein in your diet. That's a big one. If you're someone that's dieting or just doesn't eat right and get enough protein, that not only slows muscle recovery, but slows connective tissue recovery. You should be getting, at the bare minimum, a half a gram of protein per pound of body weight. So I weigh 160, so at bare minimum, 80 grams a day of protein. And really my target is more like 120 grams of protein a day. So maybe about 3/4 of a gram per pound of body weight. And there's some evidence that strength power athletes, especially those that consume very lean diets, maybe should even have as much as a gram of protein per pound of body weight, which 160 grams would be a heck of a lot of protein for me to consume. I guess if I had 3 or 4 protein shakes in a day, in addition to my food that I eat, I could get there, but that just seems a little bit excessive to me. But again, there's some research that shows that could be beneficial to certain strength power athletes. Nutrition, training, recovery, they're all very vital in recovery from injury and helping you avoid getting injured in the first place. But those elbow injuries, once they get out of hand, if they really become inflamed and chronic, long-lasting for months, seasons, years, I've heard from, unfortunately, a lot of climbers over the years in those situations. It's really tough to get those to resolve. And yeah, a cortisone shot can provide miraculous recovery, but it's not recovery. It's just masking the condition. And it's very controversial whether you should even get a cortisone shot for something like epicondylitis in your elbows. And so my message to anyone out there with elbow pain is, heed that warning of the pain immediately, because if you set it off and just continue on into this chronic, what becomes tendinosis, which is failed healing, it's hard to get out of. Oftentimes they have to go in and surgically excise the diseased tissue, that failed healing. There's a new procedure called Tenix, where it's a microsurgery that is much less invasive. Basically, as a little needle goes in and pulverizes the diseased tendon tissue, kind of eliminates it and allows the body then to move on to the healing phase. And so that's probably TMI for most people listening, but the elbows can be really problematic. So at all costs, you want to try to avoid getting into that cycle of chronic elbow injury. Okay, so I guess we've covered a lot here in this episode. I hope you found it to be valuable. If you came in late, you can watch this video on demand on the Training for Climbing YouTube channel, where it will reside forever, I guess. And do check out my new Training for Climbing podcast, which I hope will post tomorrow, where I'll talk about the role of genetics in climbing performance, injury, and does it really matter in the grand scheme of things in terms of determining how hard you or I will climb? The answer is maybe, but maybe not. So I'll leave you hanging on that one. Okay, well, thanks for joining me here at the Café. Hope to see you again in a few weeks. I'm going to be heading to the Red River Gorge in March, so maybe I'll do an episode from there, one rest day. And if you're at the Red, maybe I'll run into you. Hope to see you wherever you're at some point in this beautiful climbing world we live in. Have a good day.